from around the country. Welcome to today's seminar. Let me first take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. And I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. A few words about our speaker. Jordy is an assistant professor of economics at Leiden University in the Netherlands. He used to be an LCC fellow when he was still with us at the Melbourne Institute, and he's still an LCC affiliate and an honorary fellow of Uni Melbourne. So I'm guessing many, if not most of you will know him. His research is at the intersection of labor economics and spatial economics, with a really broad range of topics from job loss over gender inequalities to social housing and commuting. He covers a lot of different things. Today, he's going to tell us about peer effects, specifically how neighbors, colleagues, and family peers affect parental labor supply. And with that, I hand over to Jordy.
Thanks, Barbara. I too acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianships of the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to their ancestors and their descendants. So thanks again, Barbara, for the nice introduction. My name is Jordy Meekes, or Jordy Meekes in Australia, or at least it was the case. So today I will present the paper, The Impact of Neighbor, Colleague and Family Peers on Parental Labor Supply, and we'll just start. So the main motivation behind this is the gender inequalities in the labor markets and gender pay gaps, etc. And governments and firms in many countries have put effort into narrowing gender gaps in employment and wages. Why? Because of equity and efficiency concerns. With respect to equity, you can think of financial dependence of mainly women, financial issues over there. Now I'm talking about this. I remember reading in the newspaper when I was still based in Australia, an article in the newspaper that financial dependence of women mainly occurs after they divorce and are at a very high rate probability or a high incidence of women who are then above 50 years. So financial independence is a key issue, but also efficiency concerns. So there has been an important influential paper that also talks about misallocation of female talent. So for both of these reasons, equity and efficiency, it's a policy goal to reduce gender inequality in the labor market. There have been many attempts, gender pay equity, anti-discrimination legislation, reducing the cost of flexibility. This paper is on the Netherlands. We use Dutch data. We use together with my co-author, Max van Lent. He's also based at Leiden University. And in the Netherlands, the cost of flexibility has been drastically reduced, especially by high female part-time employment. So the transition from full-time to part-time is very high, but actually in the Netherlands, it's not really about a transition from full-time to part-time, but more starting your career as a part-time employed individual, rather than starting off at full-time and then switch to part-time over the years. So over the last decades, gender gaps in the labor force participation rate and employment have become narrower over time. So I put wages into brackets. So wages, the gender pay gaps reduced over time, but they stabilize more or less. So they're still quite striking and quite large. And despite these developments, as in many other countries, gender gaps in the Netherlands are pervasive. So just to give an overview of gender inequalities in the Dutch labor market, and on the next slide, I show a couple of other countries, including Australia. This is based on 2018 data. Why 2018? Because that is the last year, in this paper at least. So the sample of this paper is based on first-time parents, and these individuals become a parent in the period 2014 to 2018. So as a benchmark, I provided these statistics for 2018, and what do we see here? So the gross labor force participation rate of women is about 75%. For men, it's about 85%. So there is a gender gap in the labor force participation rate of about 9 percentage points. So the gender hourly wage gap is about 50%, or in this situation also percentage points, because the gap is expressed as in terms of men's hourly wages, which is relatively high. This gap is much larger for employees in the private sector compared to the public sector. So this paper is on gender inequalities mainly in paid working hours. So looking at the full-time job employment rate is important. in the Netherlands, 1 out of 4 women are in a full-time job. This is 3 out of 4 men. So it's actually interesting. In the Netherlands, not only women tend to work not so many paid working hours, but men also work relatively at least less hours compared to other men in other countries. So the gender inequality, the gap in full-time employment rate is about 48 percentage points. So I also analyzed commutes. So commutes I always put in. This paper is not on commutes, but of course there's trading off of wages against commutes. So that's why I typically include it in my presentations on gender inequalities in the labor market. Maybe good to say, given this is an international audience as well, full-time employment is defined in the Netherlands as working 35 hours or more. So over here, I show this, I give this overview, but then for a couple of other countries, maybe people in the audience have reference point for Germany, UK, or US, but Australia, I thought it's good to integrate for sure. So compared to the Netherlands, Australia has a similar gap in the labor force participation rate and wages as well. But the gap in full-time employment is much lower in Australia, still high compared to UK and US, but lower compared to the Netherlands. That was also my experience here, but that's just anecdotal that for people in my network, at least, women who came from the Netherlands, for them, it was actually very challenging to work part-time in Australia. This could be just because of the small sample size, but of course there's a role of employers and a role of employees in working part-time or full-time or not. I also show the commutes, which is relatively constant across all these different countries. Okay, so now back to the motivation and what we will do in this paper. So labor market outcomes of women and men remain different. Why? So there are many, the literature is huge on this. I'm an economist, so I'm covering mainly the econ literature. Feel free to reach out with other insights. And I know in sociology, psychology, there are many important insights that are also partly used, at least in econ papers. But discrimination is a very important type of job. So is there gendered selection into different type of industries or occupations, but also social norms and expectations. And the social norms and expectations, that is the reason why we initially pursued this paper. Parenthood is a main driver. It's a critical transition point of women's career and men's career, where traditional gender roles balancing home and work life become very important, causing child penalties. Generally, what we see is that fathers do not experience much change in their labor market outcomes, like paid working hours, hourly wages, etc. But there are large penalties for the mothers. Just to emphasize here, the child penalty in paid working hours directly widens the gender earnings gap. It shouldn't widen the gender hourly wage gap per se, at least not in the short term. But if you work fewer hours, by definition, the gender earnings gap is widened. That's why we think, at least looking at paid working hours is very important, and also critical in understanding how changes occur in the gender earnings gap. Is this because of changes in hourly wages or because of changes in the number of paid working hours? Most policies and research projects focus on women. So what determines their choices and what can policy do to increase their labor supply? Fewer papers focus on fathers. And that is what this paper does, although we do analyze both fathers and mothers. Okay, so this is the first more descriptive result, just to look at changes in the paid working hours of women and men upon the arrival of the first child. So at T is 0, the person becomes a parent. We generally, in this paper, study the period 24 months before becoming a parent until 72 months after becoming a parent. We have the solid black line here for women, the dashed gray line here for men. On the y-axis, we have the working hours. This is monthly data. The average working hours for men is about 160. The average working hours of women at baseline, so that is at T equals -12, is about 120 or 130 hours. So I express the changes in the level of hours. So women experience a reduction compared to the reference period, which is exactly 1 year before the arrival of the first child, of about 28, 29 hours. And this represents an impact of about 22%. It decreases a bit, but then increases a bit over time. And the 30 hours is more or less is relatively stable after 6 years since becoming a parent. For men, the impact is only about 6%. In levels, this equals about 10 hours after 6 years. The majority of this is driven by changes. This all represents within changes. We also include individual fixed effects here. Okay, so we see a huge change in the working hours. And our question basically is, what determines changes in working hours? To what extent do peer effects matter? Okay. Then a couple of questions that we try to answer here are, do fathers work less when their peers work less after becoming a parent? And similarly for mothers, do mothers work less when their peers work less after becoming a parent? Why would peers affect focal individuals' labor market outcomes? That's because of network contagion. So an individual's environment affects general attitudes through interactions with peers. This is because of imitation behavior and conformity preferences. So imitation behavior is, for example, if I look at a colleague, let's say my colleague Paul, I'm on purpose using a male name here because in this paper what we do is we look at same-sex peers. So men look at male peers, women look at female peers. And my colleague Paul became a parent before me. And if Paul reduced his working hours, then because of imitation behavior, I'm also inclined to reduce my working hours. If Paul didn't, then maybe I'm also more inclined to not change my working hours after becoming a parent. Then conformity preferences are the situation where Paul didn't change his working hours or didn't take a parental leave. You can apply it to many different changes in the context of your work. And because Paul didn't, I would like to conform, but Paul didn't change his working hours, so then I'm also likely not to change my working hours. I get a disutility if I would change my hours. So for me personally, it would be challenging if all of my peers didn't change their working hours after becoming a parent, that I would change them after becoming a parent, because I would like to conform. So these are the two theoretical mechanisms why you would expect peer effects to occur. And the key question is whether fathers are affected by peer effects. Are mothers affected by peer effects? Which peer network is most important? And we use 3 different peer networks. We look at neighbors, we look at colleagues, and we look at family. And how we define peers, I will explain in a bit. Key findings. So we show long-term statistically significant peer effects on both fathers and mothers. Colleague peer effects are largest. So we look at peer effects of peers, and the way to interpret this is colleague peer effects on fathers are equal to 0.5 hours of a 10-hour change a month in the average working hours of my peers. So for women, the impact is 3 times as large. So if female peers increase their hours by 10 hours, then the impact on the focal individual, we define it as an individual of interest. This individual would change the hours then by 1.5 hours. The underlying intuition, what is driving colleague peer effects is workplace culture, availability and uptake of parental leave and part-time work, and consequences for promotions. So if I reduce my hours after becoming a parent, and this would have negative consequences for my promotion opportunities, these kinds of things, then probably I'm less likely to actually reduce my hours. So these are the underlying mechanisms we expect. We don't test this. We expect are critical in understanding the workplace peer effects. So with respect to neighbor peer effects, you could consider looking at the importance of the local community. Think of daily routines outside of the home. Who picks up the child, who brings the child to childcare, who picks the child up, who is the one a member of the household that maybe changes his or her hours, start times, and ending times, these kinds of things. So neighbor peer effects in our paper are equal to about 0.5 hours of a 10-month of a 10-hour change in the average hours of peers. Important to say, the neighbor peer effects are less robust for men, more robust for women. So overall, what we find is that colleague peer effects are most important. Then family peer effects, we do not find them for fathers and also not for mothers. We have some evidence that they're actually negative for mothers, but these effects are really small and less robust. And what is driving family peer effects? You could reflect on shared culture, family expectations, these kinds of things. If there are insights on this, on the role or the type of peer effects given the network that we're looking at, so colleagues, neighbors, or family, feel free to let me know. Okay, then as is common in econ papers, we give the key findings already, but also key contributions. So we use monthly paid working hours up to 2024 using the Dutch data, and we analyze both fathers and mothers, peer effects on fathers and mothers. We feel this is interesting and very important to use recent data because a lot of things changed over the last 1 to 2 decades. We use whole population network data. So this is a paper on peer effects, but we look at potential peers. So for example, if you work at the same firm, you're considered to be a colleague peer. If you work at if you live in the same neighborhood, you are considered to be a neighbor peer. This is based on admin data. So the benefit is we can do this for the entire population of individuals who became a parent. But this is very much different compared to survey data on relations between people, on the strength of the link between people, etc. And what's unique of this paper is that we integrate 3 network layers, so neighbors, colleagues, and family. And based on this, we can also show and analyze which network is most important. So we contribute to the literature on peer effects that uses peers of peers information, for example, on working hours. So we follow mainly the paper by Nicoletti and co-authors. There are also papers that basically use the same design as we are using, but then study parental leave uptake or peer effects of taking parental leave. For example, the paper by Carlson and Rashid. This literature is slightly different compared to the literature that uses exogenous variation from a parental leave form to estimate peer effects on parental leave taken. And overall, we argue we contribute to the literature on gender inequalities in the labor market by getting a better understanding what is driving changes in paid working hours after becoming a parent. Then I get to the data. We use monthly microdata for the Netherlands until September 2024. So this would cover about 7.3 million employees. Our final sample consists of 315,000 first-time mothers and 267,000 first-time fathers. So how did we get to this sample? We follow mothers and fathers with first childbirth between 2014 to 2018. We refer to these individuals as the focal individuals or individual I in the paper, but I do the same in this presentation. We excluded individuals aged below 20 or over 45 years. We excluded individuals who were self-employed in the year before parenthood. Why? Because we cannot observe paid working hours for the self-employed. The key outcome variables, paid working hours. As said, we analyzed 3 network layers, neighbors, colleagues, family. In this presentation, I tend to use the word peer and peers of peers very often. I hope it's all of you can follow it. Sometimes we use abbreviations. So P stands for the peers of individual, I, peers of the focal individual. P of P refers to the peers of peers. So we do not only look at peers, we also look at the peers of peers. And this is more from because of our identification strategy, and which I will explain in a bit. So first, the definitions of peers. Peers are measured in the year of first childbirth. So January 1st of the given year. Imagine I became a parent in 2017, then I look at the peers on January 1st, 2017. We follow the literature here and we use so-called homogeneous peers, which are peers of the same sex and educational attainment. We have 3 education groups: high education, non-high education, which basically covers low to medium educational attainment. In the Dutch data, there's also a high incidence of missing educational attainment. Not that much though, but there is, which we put in a separate group as well to not introduce selection bias here. We also run the model separately by educational attainment to study whether there are differences in the role of peer effects for different educational attainment groups. So peers of individual I of the focal individual gave birth 1 to 4 years before the focal individual. Why do we include peers or define peers such that they gave birth 1 to 4 years before the focal individual to limit the issue of reverse causality? What I mean with that is the peer should affect the focal individual instead of the other way around. So we have I's neighbors, we have colleague peers, and we have family peers. On average, given these selection criteria, on average, focal individuals in our sample have 13 to 16 neighbor peers. They have 83 to 116 colleague peers, and they only have 1.4 family peers. Then we go to the peers of peers. So peers of peers gave birth 2 to 5 years before the focal individual and 1 to 4 years before the peer. The time windows are because of the same reason as I explained before with respect to reverse causality. We have 6 network by network dimensions. And what do I mean with this? We have colleagues of I's neighbors. We have families of the focal individual's neighbors. We have neighbors of I's colleagues, we have family of I's colleagues, we have neighbors of I's family, and colleagues of I's family. So I can be honest here, integrating 3 networks was amazing to study differences between these 3 networks, but because we have now 6 network by network dimensions, well, how to put this, it exploded a bit in terms of data analysis and data preparation. I hope all of you can follow. How I look at this, we have I and C, so the focal individual. I know peers, and this is about neighbor peers, and I know the colleague are the peers of peers. So the colleagues of I's neighbors. We have family of I's neighbors. We have neighbors of I's colleagues. Given the lower sample size or the fewer family peers that we observe, especially the network by network dimensions in which family is used, they have a bit of lower power. Most convincing are the neighbor peer effects based on the colleagues, who are then the peers of peers, and the colleague peer effects where the neighbors are the peers of peers. Okay, then we
interrupt you, Jordy. Sorry, because there was
sure.
a question on how peers are defined, which I thought you were getting to, but how do you measure community peers was a question from Janine. And from myself, is a family of a neighbor not typically also a neighbor?
The family of a neighbor, whether they are also neighbors. Okay, 2 questions. With respect to Janine, thanks for your question, both of you. How we define a community is the neighbor. So basically, my neighbor peers is my community. Whether this is justified or not, feel free to let me know. How we define neighbors is based on their neighborhood. So in the Netherlands, a neighborhood on average consists of about 1,000 to 1,500 households. We look at people who are then the neighbor peers who satisfy the criteria, so the age criteria, and also those who became a parent 1 to 4 years before the focal individual. Where would you run into these peers? For example, at childcare center, for example, at primary schools. That is how we define the community peers. Then with respect to your question, Barbara, imagine the situation where, so I have the focal individual, I have the neighbor peers of the focal individual, and then the colleagues of I's neighbors. It could be the case that, and I think that was what your question was about, but then with respect to family, it could be the case that the family of I's neighbor, for example, live in the same neighborhood as my neighbor peers. So I understand that this can be a bit tricky, but imagine this is the case, we look for this and we exclude these pairs of peers and peers of peers. So we artificially overcome this issue. The incidence of this is rather low. I think it's about 1%. So we exclude 1% of observations. So yeah. Okay. Then I continue with the empirical model, and feel free to interrupt me further for clarification questions. So we, as mentioned, we follow the paper by Nicoletti and co-authors. We have OLS regression specification for monthly paid working hours Y, for focal individual I, where tau represents the time since becoming a parent. Yeah, and considered, I will have a light version of the method in this presentation, and if people are interested in hearing more details, feel free to reach out to me after the seminar. So we are interested in the peer effect. The independent, the parameter of interest is delta here. So that is the impact of the average working hours of my peers on the focal individual. We have different networks, D1. This represents the distance 1 network. So we do this for family peers, for neighbor peers, and colleague peers, all in a separate regression, in a separate model. We also include control variables in the factor X. All these control variables are measured at 12 months before the individual became a parent. This includes individuals' characteristics and partners' characteristics. The key issue here is that there is a bias in delta. For example, it's not random who your peers are. I worked at the Melbourne Institute. Maybe people join a Melbourne Institute who are alike in different ways. They are alike in ways that we can observe, educational attainment, but also alike in terms of things that we cannot observe. So then there is a correlation, and this is an issue if there are unobserved characteristics of peers and focal individuals that are correlated. So we need to solve this issue. And how we do that, I will explain based on this figure. So imagine this is me. This is my partner, Alice, and this is our 19-month-old baby toddler, Lore. So I became a parent in April 2024. And then I look at my peers. So I have colleague peers, I have neighbor peers, and family peers. I'm interested in the colleague peer effects on me. As I mentioned before, this is tricky because there is non-random selection into working at Leiden University in this situation. So what I do is I look at my colleagues, but then I look at the neighbors of my colleagues and the family members of my colleagues in an instrumental variable estimation strategy. So what I'm using is the variation that is caused by the impact of the neighbors of my colleagues. So the neighbors of my colleagues impact my neighbors, and through that I'm affected by my colleague peer effects. And I do the same for the other peer-of-peer network family. Basically, this intuition, I do the same for my family peer to estimate the family peer effects on me. So I look at colleagues of my family, I look at neighbors of my family, and I do the same for the neighbor peer effects. So if I write all of this out, we use the instrumental variables estimator, instrumenting the average working hours of I's peers with the average working hours of I's peers of peers. Peers hours are average of hours which changes by time since childbirth. For the peers of peers hours, what we use is the average of hours worked. This is taken as time constant, and we take the average of the hours worked by the peers of peers 12 months after the peers of peers became a parent. This also prevents then reverse causality issues. I won't go into detail here, but we discuss in greater detail in the paper, which is online as a working paper, the relevance condition, the exogeneity condition. We include the so-called individual IV. We include regional fixed effects, sector fixed effects, and month of birth fixed effects. And the first stage is as follows, and I will continue here with the results. Okay. So every time I have 6 sets of results. We have here INC, INF, ICN, ICF, etc. So let's first focus on the neighbor peer effects on the focal individuals. This is the impact of the average hours of the peers of peers on the average hours of the peers. So this is the first stage and tests the relevance condition of the instrumental variable method. So what is the impact here? If the peers of peers increase their hours by 1, their average monthly working hours by 1, peers will increase their average working hours by 0.75. So please let me explain. I'm talking about increases in paid working hours, but it could also be a decrease of in paid working hours of 1. And that would then imply that the impact on the peers would realize a 0.75 reduction in the average working hours of the peers. Okay. These are all first stages, and what we can see is the first stage is very strong for neighbor peer effects. For the colleagues of ICE neighbors, it's very strong for the neighbors of ICE colleagues. We see that the first stage is a bit weaker for these situations in which the peer-of-peer network is based on family. So we see the F here. Okay. Then I quickly continue. What is also common in the literature is to show the F statistics on the instrument. What we show here is the y-axis is different in this presentation, but the F values are really high. So we are confident the instrument is relevant. Then we go to the results in which we're interested. So this is the second stage, and we look at the coefficients here. What do these coefficients show? These are the estimated peer effects. So we have neighbor peer effects here on the focal individuals. We have also neighbor peer effects here on the focal individuals. The neighbor peer effects over here in the left top corner. These are based on the estimation where we use colleagues of ICE neighbors as the peer-of-peer network. Over here, we use family of ICE neighbors as the peer-of-peer network. Okay, on the y-axis, we have the working hours, and the x-axis, we have the number of months since first birth. So we track individuals again from 24 months before the focal individual becomes a parent until 72 months after. And what do we find here? So we have for women, the black solid line, for men, the dashed gray line. For men, neighbor peer effects are weaker than for women. Both start from the month since first birth. Both are larger than 0, but are actually relatively small. So for men, it's about 0.02. For women, it's 0.03. So this is really relatively small. If we look at this subgraph based on the peers of peers, based on the family layer, the power of the analysis is weaker and the result is less robust. So from this, what can we say? So we do observe neighbor peer effects, statistically significant neighbor peer effects. They are relatively small, though. We are able to analyze, to find them when we use colleagues of ICE neighbors as the peer-of-peer network layer, but not when we use family. So as I mentioned before, the family network is often, there's much less variation because the number of family peers is much lower in our analysis. So I will ignore the family peer effects for now and continue with the colleague peer effects. So the colleague peer effects in the right top corner, those are really large. They are larger for women and for men. So we argue in the paper colleague peer effects are strongest. They are much larger than neighbor peer effects and family peer effects. We also argue in the paper that colleague peer effects are stronger for women than for men. For women, they go to about 0.15 to 0.14 up to 1 year after becoming a parent, and they go down to about 0.08 6 years after becoming a parent. The results based on where the family layer is used as the peer-of-peer network layer are remarkably robust. They're comparable. So again, what does this mean? Let's say the colleague peer effect is 0.10. If my peers increase their hours, their average working hours by 10 a month, then the focal individual will increase the hours, the paid working hours by 1. That is what this means. Is this a large or a high or a small effect? Actually, after presenting this paper, I've come across both or two opinions. One is they're relatively small. Other people feel they're actually relatively large because this is about a 0.10 implies a 10% change of the increase or the change in the peers' working hours. But I leave this also for you to reflect on this. So again, we don't find convincing family pair effects. If we find them, they're really small. We do a full heterogeneity analysis in the paper. What we find there is that this is driven by specific subgroups. Negative peer effects, what do they imply? Well, if I see my family peers increase their hours, I'm actually inclined to reduce my working hours. That is what this means. Whether I would trust these estimates, I would say no, given also our robustness checks and placebo checks that we apply. But I think there could be an interesting spin here. Imagine we do trust them. What does this mean? Well, maybe if I see my family peers changing their working hours and I see it doesn't work for them, then I'm actually inclined to do the opposite. So that could be an interesting angle after you learn what doesn't work instead of learning what actually does work. Okay, so we do many heterogeneity analysis and robustness checks. I won't go into detail here, but I wanted to discuss a couple of the heterogeneity effects that we analyze because I thought they are quite interesting. So we do find some heterogeneity in neighbor peer effects. And this heterogeneity depends mainly on individual characteristics. So we find that neighbor peer effects are stronger for those born outside of the Netherlands compared to natives. Instead, colleague peer effects tend to vary more by job characteristic. We find stronger colleague peer effects for those in non-standard employment. So stronger colleague peer effects for those in temporary employment or part-time employment. We also find much stronger colleague peer effects on vocal individuals who are employed at larger firms. We don't find strong, robust family peer effects, so we also don't find any heterogeneity in these family peer effects. Then I wanted to conclude and discuss. To wrap up, two more slides. So we find statistically significant peer effects observed on both fathers and mothers. Colleague peer effects are found to be the strongest. So about a 5 to 15% of change compared to the change in the average working hours of peers. Neighbor peer effects are smaller and less robust. Family peer effects are not found for men. They are found negative for women, but they're also less robust. So overall, we are quite convinced of the colleague peer effects, that they are statistically significant, that they are substantial, and that they are most important. And especially for those individuals who work at large firms, they go up to 0.3 or 0.4, as compared to the 0.05 or 0.15 that I showed earlier. The current policy debate in the Netherlands, and I thought that might be interesting, and I was wondering how that would be in Australia nowadays, is there's a huge current policy debate in the Netherlands on formal childcare and making formal childcare cheaper. However, that's at least the argument in the Netherlands, this makes accessibility to childcare less equal because there is no maximum price of childcare, hourly price in the Netherlands. So what does this mean? If it would be cheaper, this would increase demand for childcare, and it pushes out lower income households because they cannot afford the amount of money that you pay on top of the childcare allowance. What people also argue in the Netherlands is that making childcare cheaper to reduce gender inequalities in the labor market, that would be relatively inefficient. And what we argue is that social multiplier is key. So if, for instance, through policy, think of parental leave policy or other policies, mothers and fathers change their number of work hours, this would also impact the decisions of other parents. So this social multiplier should be accounted for and integrated in a cost-benefit analysis, if you will, to get a better understanding of the impact not only on the affected individuals, but also on the network as a whole. Given that we find that colleague peer effects are stronger, strongest, could argue that there is an important role for firms in narrowing gender gaps. Firm diversity and inclusion strategies could be key. Flexible work arrangements, partner leave policies. It could be argued this should be also made available to men if they are not available. At the same time, for both men and women, it should not cause inequality in promotions and career opportunities if we really want to reduce gender inequalities in the labor market. So this is the first paper on peer effects by Max and me. If there are suggestions for future research, other peer effects, other networks, other outcome variables other than paid working hours, feel free to let me know.